I moved to San Francisco from Maine in August of 1985, eager to shed my New England wardrobe, but unsure of what to wear next. Inside me, there was a me who wanted to come out, but I just wasn't sure how. I had made friends with a coworker who invited me to join her for the Folsom Street Fair. I said, thinking of the country fairs back home, sure. It was late September, a glorious, short-wearing weathered day, sunny and warm. The winds were a whisper. The soft dome of blue sky circled above. We pedaled our bikes down from the Mission and parked a couple of blocks from Folsom Street. I heard the thump, thump, thump of the music blasting, the sounds of the crowds, the smell of the smoke from the food vendors' trucks. And then I noticed others on the sidewalk. Folks dressed in an array of leather outfits that I had no name for. Folks dressed in glitter and folks dressed in sequins. There were buff bodies and big bodies and beautiful bodies. There were bare bodies. There were kings and queens in glorious drag. There were whips and chains and collars and chaps. And the vibe, it was beautiful. And there I was, wearing my Maine t-shirt and my Red Sox baseball cap, and I thought, wow, this is not the Yarmouth Clam Festival. The Folsom Street Fair was my welcome into San Francisco culture. Nothing from New England prepared me for that moment. I looked like an outsider, the Red Sox cap. What was I thinking? But it didn't really matter. I stepped off the curb and jumped in and waved my hands and swung my hips. That jump off the curb was my first step. That day, I felt a shift inside. Something had broke open, and I began the process of coming out and becoming myself. Now, I've learned a lot since that day. I recognize now that had it not been for the generations that came before, I may never have found my way out, found my way to the Folsom Street Fair, to the Pride Parade, or to the Bay Times newspaper, for those of you who remember it, where in a personal ad section caught my eye, leading me to meet Wendy, now my wife, way back in 1988. 16 years earlier, on June 28th, 1969, not that many years ago when I think about it, a group of young, queer, homeless youth, trans women and men, drag kings and queens, risked their lives to shift the culture. No longer willing to be closed in, no longer willing to have their dignity, their humanity ignored or threatened, their act of resistance gave way to a now queering culture that over time has expanded our understanding of love, acceptance, inclusion, care, and celebration. Fast forward. Earlier this year, I was introduced to the artist, writer, and teacher Makoto Fujimura, whose book, Culture Care, Reconnecting Beauty for Our Common Life, helped me think about culture in a new way. Fujimura's main idea is when we engage in creative acts that generate beauty and wholeness, we transform culture. That resonated for me. Culture care is based on the principles of generativity, generosity, and thinking generationally. Wasn't this part of what Stonewall taught us and continues to teach us? Isn't this what all liberation movements teach us? That we are better off when we create spaces that nurture hearts and souls? I think so. Culture, writes Fujimura, is what makes life worth living. To create this flourishing cultural ecosystem, we need to be generative thinkers and cross-pollinators. Together, we create systems that are rich, diverse, and bubbling with life. This takes time, nurturance, care if our aim is to create something that will sustain for future generations. How do we cultivate bubbly lives that generate joy? Ask a drag queen. Some of you may know about Drag Queen Story Hour. DQSH was the brainchild or the love child of Radar, a Bay Area queer literary organization that supports queer artists. Radar created Drag Queen Story Hour, where storytelling drag kings and queens share space in public libraries, reading to children and families. Think of DQSH as a cultural ecosystem, a nurturing space where lives grow and flourish. Founded in 2015 here in San Francisco, Drag Queen Story Hour has grown and now has chapters around the country, even around the world. Radar is blessed with generative thinkers, creating ways for different cultures to cross borders, connect, and cultivate relationships. Together, the kids, the kings, the queens co-create a culture of care. The rich soil fostered by queer artists and activists, from Stonewall to Drag Queen Story Hour, has yielded fruitful crops that continue to flourish and grow. All it takes is some magical fairy dust and a pair of bedazzled gardening gloves. Our kings and queens are cultural catalysts, creating new, something life-giving, something worthy. Their gifts burst forth in a flourishing display, blessing the world with their beauty. Now, not all of us are cut out to wear the same sequined cloth, just some of us might prefer a pair of overalls. But if our goal is to build up the cultural topsoil, we need to practice this ancient art of observation and response. This is how we tend to the landscape and make it blossom. We are all creative catalysts, bursting forth with gifts to share, stories to tell, recipes that will knock your socks off. We are gardeners and farmers, painters and poets, magicians and musicians, caregivers and lovers, teachers and learners. We are all artists. We are all part of creation, and we are all creators. We are stewards working to cultivate the seeds that will bring beauty, healing, and joy into our broken world. That is what justice-making looks like, and it is beautiful. In the new documentary, Biggest Little Farm, we meet John and Molly Chester, two cultural caretakers and creative cultivators from Santa Monica, one a filmmaker, one a chef, who buy an abandoned ranch with the vision of creating a sustainable organic farm, a small slice of heaven, if you will. When they arrive, The land is parched, dry, hard as stone. Everything is dead around them, even the dirt. Molly pounds a shovel into the parched soil and loosens up a hard cement-like clump and throws it to the ground, where it lands with a thud. The camera pulls back, and we see a wide expanse of dried up, lifeless fields and orchards. But Molly, she's smiling. It's clear that these two horticultural catalyzers have something to prove. Now, rebirth doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't usually happen alone. Friends invest in their dreams. A cohort of young and enthusiastic farmhands show up. Workers who had been part of the old farm stay on, bringing their wisdom and knowledge. They find a Virginia farm whisperer named Alan York who teaches them how to build an internal ecosystem. It will take time, York tells them. Years go by. Animals are brought in to eat down the bramble and the weeds. Their waste is turned into rich compost tea and is fed back to the soil. There are cover crops and worm bins, bees and birds, snails and aphids and bugs of all kinds show up by the thousands. But the ducks and the chickens come to the rescue. The coyote, the hawks, the barn owls that arrive and keep the gophers in check. The work is painstaking and painful. There are losses and lessons and more losses and more lessons as Molly and John learn to listen to the land and respond to its needs. Observation followed by creativity is becoming our greatest ally, John says. 7 years pass. John and Molly plant some 10,000 orchard trees and more than 200 different kinds of crops and raise a wide variety of animals. And in the process, Apricot Lane Farms becomes a microcosm of planet Earth. They are planting seeds from which life flourishes and ecosystems flow. Molly and John are committed stewards, tenderly nurturing a land back to life that promises to spring forth for years to come. Makoto Fujimura tends to his paintings, utilizing an ancient style called Nihonga. Do I have that right, Reiko? Nihonga? We'll say you said yes. Where colored minerals are ground into fine particles and then layered onto paper. Not unlike the process of building the soil at Apricot Lane Farm. Each has learned that you have to go slowly, to be patient, and trust time. For Fujimura, it is the quiet space of his painting studio that he nurtures his creativity and waits to see what will break through. Makoto is a devoted Christian, drawing great inspiration from the teachings and life of Jesus. He is fond of Jesus' metaphor about tending the sheep. In the story, we are told that each of us needs nurturing, safe spaces where we are cared for and tended to. But the story also says that to thrive, we need to roam, move past the gates into the wider pastures and beyond. We need to see and experience what is out there so that we can grow and flourish. When thinking about culture care and how we tend to it, I prefer a tidal metaphor. I grew up on tidal rivers and spent hours watching how the waters flow in and out, curve to the shores and then recede, moved by a force that is beyond us. It's like a dance. We are like those tidal waters and estuaries. We move in and out of cultural ecosystems, never separate, though it can feel that way at times, and sometimes we might prefer it. But together, we breathe in and we breathe out. Together, we create something worthy, something whole, something holy. As a faith community committed to fostering a culture of care, embracing our role as creative catalysts, we need to tend to the creative forces that move in us and around us. As we engage in the deep work of becoming a more inclusive and diverse community, a welcoming community for people of color, queer and trans people, people of varying abilities, varying points of view, we must learn to cultivate spaces that hold to the principles that are generative, generous, and offer something beautiful to the generations who will follow us. We need a breakthrough theology that helps us see past the bedrock of assumptions and prepares us to consider the possibilities beyond what we see. In the words of Wendell Berry, we need to walk alongside the vein of light. This need to create generative spaces was brought home to me after seeing my colleague Otto O'Connor at our recent General Assembly in Spokane. Otto is a former member of this church, now the minister at our Unitarian Universalist Church in Malden, Massachusetts. Over lunch, we talked about how our denomination is slowly learning to create spaces for those who live in the margins of our making. Otto said, "It's one thing to say we welcome you. It's another thing to say we built this with you in mind." The time has come for us to recenter, to reimagine our sacred spaces and birth a breakthrough theology that lets all those precious and beautiful veins of light to burst forth and burn bright. To be a community that makes culture care its mission, we need to be observant and responsive shepherds, nurturing those in our care and make space when space is needed. We need to put on our waders and wade into the waters, feel our bodies move to the rhythm and the ebb and the flow of the tides. We need to train our eyes to notice the veins of light that live in each of us and help them to shine. Friends, let's nurture the seeds of love and beauty that live inside us and are all around us. Remember, we are part of an embedded constellation of relationships. We are given this moment, this time, this beginning here and now. Imagine how far our light can travel. Let us leave rich stories filled with tales of love and beauty, care and creativity. Let our justice joy-making be the stories our children's children will tell for the years to come.